It looks like folks are filing in now, Rich, so maybe we give them a few more minutes and I'll share the screen and we can go from there.
Sounds great.
Yeah, based on the registrants, looks like we may be reaching critical mass now. So let's start and go from there.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Rich Castle. I run the clean energy and sustainability team at Capalino. We're an urban strategy firm based in New York City, and we work with clients that are pushing the envelope towards bringing a clean energy economy to New York City, New York State, and the region. We're really excited to be bringing to you today a fantastic topic: the road to commercial fleet electrification, shared rental opportunities for brands and carriers. It's exciting because what you're going to hear about in the next few minutes and over the course of the coming hour is really a new model for thinking about how do we ensure that packages can be delivered to homes and offices in New York City and more broadly using zero-emission vehicles for that last mile delivery. You're going to hear more about why this is so important in terms of improving air quality and meeting our climate goals, and why the people who you're going to hear from in a moment are really unlocking and overcoming some hurdles that have stood in the way of clean, zero-emission deliveries in the past and are opening up opportunities for these zero-emission deliveries in the future. You're also going to hear about how you can get involved and become part of the zero-emission future here in New York City and the region, and bring zero-emission last mile deliveries to fruition. So you can, I'm not controlling the slide, so I'll say next slide. But what you're going to hear a conversation that involves really the leaders in this effort, not just frankly in our city, in our region, but really nationwide. You're going to hear from Stephen Molk, who is the project manager who's responsible for implementing what I think is the most ambitious zero-emission commitment of any company in the delivery space in the country. Ikea has committed to all home deliveries in the US using zero-emission vehicles by 2025. And you're going to hear from Stephen, who is the key person to make that happen. You're also going to hear from James Eberhardt, the founder and CEO of Fluid Truck. Fluid Truck is pioneering the concept of zero-emission deliveries using a vehicle sharing model. So if you've heard of Zipcar, if you've ever used bike sharing, if you've ever used scooter sharing, Fluid Truck is taking and adapting that model to commercial deliveries. And James is really the leader in the whole country on that topic. And you're going to hear from Harold Rickenbacker from EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. If you don't know EDF, it's one of the leading environmental organizations, not just in the region, not just in the country, but really around the world. And it's hard to think of an environmental issue, including the one we're going to talk about today, where EDF is not at the forefront of thinking. And Harold is managing the clean air and innovation sector of EDF's work with the business community, a division of EDF known as EDF Plus Business. It's really a fantastic panel. I'm going to get out of the way and let the experts speak. You can see here, we're going to talk a little bit about why this matters, how do we address sustainability concerns in last mile delivery, and most important, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this new New York, New Jersey EV partnership that's being piloted by Fluid, Ikea, and EDF. Some next steps specifically around how do you get involved, and we'll have ample time for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to say next slide, and welcome Harold.
Thank you, Rich, for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect, thank you. Again, my name is Harold Rickenbacker, and I work for the Environmental Defense Fund as a Clean Air and Innovation Manager based in our Washington, D.C. office. So naturally, I'll start off with some context and make the link between air pollution from transportation and health impacts. Well, air pollution accounts for more than 7 million premature deaths each year globally. And millions more, 33 million to be exact, suffer from asthma, emergency room visits, and hospitalization or lost work days as a result of exposure to air pollution. Now, in particular, communities around the world continue to struggle with the health implications of local air quality associated with the movement of goods. In 2015, 400,000 premature deaths globally resulted from transportation-related air pollution. And despite making up only 4% of vehicle class around the road, delivery trucks, tractor trailers contribute to 50% of NOx emissions and 60% of fine particulates from all vehicle types. Now, there is obviously clear and equity lens to this work, where warehouses and distribution centers that manage last mile delivery are often concentrated in low wealth communities and communities of color. You know, often known as dry ports or those fulfillment centers that are inland. They're actually closer to where people live and therefore increase the health impact from their exposure. In fact, a recent study done by my team here at EDF found that transportation-related air pollution can be 8 times worse, even one end of a block to another. So the point being, proximity matters for health, and your zip code is an important social determinant of community health as well as your personal health and well-being. Now, moving right along, as we think about several different stakeholder groups that help acknowledge the sense of urgency and the opportunity for zero-emission last mile delivery, let's first begin by thinking about some of the consumers, right? So us. You know, we are in the midst of a new era of sustainability in which sustainability-based values, attitudes, and preferences are driving lifestyle choices in our buying decisions. Customers globally are literally voting with their wallets, and they seek products and brands that align with those values. IBM and the National Retail Federation put out a survey in 2020 that revealed 6 in 10 consumers are willing to change their shopping habits to reduce their environmental impact. And at the same time, corporations are making those same commitments, and those commitments are on the rise as well. Companies are setting really ambitious climate goals, many of which include transportation as that centerpiece, which is the reason why we're on the call today. Now, for example, Ikea, one of our trusted partners, has committed 100% of their zero-emission last mile delivery and become climate positive. Walmart has committed to 100% zero-emission transport by 2040, and that's just to name a few. Now, thinking a little bit more around our investors, you know, responsible investing has increasingly become a top industry priority. Between 2018 and 2020, environmental and social governance green assets in the U.S. increased by 42% to $17 trillion. You know, ESG issues and reporting is not just a general concern for investors, but it's becoming a core part of why companies invest and why companies exclude other companies from their asset portfolios. And then the last group here I'd like to briefly talk about is communities. You know, community voices are also on the rise. For those of us who follow a lot of state legislation, California actually recently passed their indirect source rule, which considers emissions from sources attracted to and associated with new developments. It puts a limit and cap on how much of an emission is allowed within that airshed. You know, for example, an indirect source could be vehicles that are attracted to that new modified development or parking lot or highway upwind of that facility, and also, you know, pollution generated from the construction of that new development itself. This is significant in the Southern California region, because the majority of warehouses, similar in New York and New Jersey, are placed in areas where online shopping isn't done, right? So this essentially means that it's important to investigate and look further into the communities that are impacted by those warehouses. And essentially they aren't consuming the products, but they're being impacted by its processes. So, with that being said, communities are really recommending and advocating for policies that advance the deployment and investment in zero emission technology, and really taking place and identifying it to say that it should be deployed and implemented in disadvantaged communities first. Now, to really zoom in or move closer to the region or the focus of this work, close to 200 million tons of freight move into and out of the 5 boroughs in New York every year. Almost 90% of those are transported in the city every day on trucks, compared to just 8% by water and another 3% by rail. New York's street network is really the backbone of the substantial freight movement, and with the backdrop of increasing freight values, multimodal green solutions are really a necessity. We've seen a lot around e-bikes, around cargo bikes in New York and other regions. But of course, for the precedents for the call today, we'd like to talk about zero emission vehicles and specifically medium and heavy duty trucks. What's also worth acknowledging is the demand for shipping services is expected to grow significantly, and it is growing significantly. Walmart has reported e-commerce sales increased by 97% since the pandemic. Amazon has reported transportation has doubled around their fulfillment centers. And due to this emerging industry trend, such as the rise in same-day delivery and more consumer choices, more delivery vehicles are inevitably on the road. While these trends are leading to more convenience for customers and unintended consequences of health, we've seen a lot around congestion and local air pollution impacts spike since the pandemic. You may ask, why are we so keen and focused on trucks and last mile delivery? But I'm sure it's obvious for this audience. But I should acknowledge that medium heavy duty trucks only make up 9% of vehicle population, but account for 39% of all transportation emissions. That's huge. And it's projected that medium heavy duty trucks will rival passenger cars and light duty trucks as the largest source of transportation GHG emissions leading into the year 2050. So the conversation for today really is, how do we introduce multimodal green solutions as a necessity? And let's first start in the New York, New Jersey region, which is why we have you on the call. Now I'd like to pass it along to Stephen. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Harold. Appreciate it. And like you said, I mean, the reason why, last mile delivery is so important, I think you touched upon all of those. These are the last mile is growing, and it's super important, and they pollute more than regular cars. And these are the very vehicles that are tooling around the neighborhoods and stuff that we live and work in. So I think that's an important place to start. But from a practical standpoint, it's also important to recognize that last mile delivery is it's technologically possible, right? So we're not in some kind of future world, with this, the technology is available today. The average delivery route in the United States is like 80 miles, and the electric trucks today can easily do 100 miles. And so we're well within that kind of strike zone to be able to go ahead and electrify last mile delivery. The reason why most people haven't or can't is because they don't own their own vehicles, right? So, and Ikea faced this exact same challenge. So we don't own our vehicles. We outsource to our transportation partners. And in fact, they don't own any vehicles either. They tend to use contractors or contract carriers, small kind of mom and pops that maybe own a couple of trucks. And so that's really the market that we're trying to convince to get into electric trucks, and they tend to be undercapitalized, and they need a certain commitment from their commercial partners in order to kind of make that happen. And so, as a result, that was the kind of the problem that we were trying to solve here in working with Fluid, which you'll hear about a little bit later on. But I think that the key here is to understand that zero emission delivery is possible using this particular model. It may not be the only model, but it is a model, and it is definitely possible to go ahead and provide zero emission delivery for your customers. And as well. So if anybody tells you that, look, I'm not Amazon, I don't own a fleet, how can I possibly electrify? No. There are ways to electrify, and that's what we're here to try to help clarify. And obviously, there's some potential benefits there as well that may be coming in the future. But specifically about New York and New Jersey, we decided to start off with New York City. It's one of our global prioritized cities in terms of our global goals. This is one of our trucks that you see here, that you see pictured here. And so what we've done is we're working with Fluid, and we've provided a rental fleet that sits behind our distribution center that allows those contractors to gain access to those vehicles on a short-term basis, on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. So there's no like long-term financial entanglements with the drivers. The drivers don't have to commit to what is today a relatively expensive vehicle relative to ICE vehicles. And so this allows them to gain access without having to kind of mortgage the house in order to get this done. So that's good news. And our third-party carriers also, the transportation companies that we work with, they like this model too, because again, they're not involved in the actual rental of the vehicle or the investment in the vehicle. So far, we've deployed 25 of these in New York City, but we're quickly scaling up to about 40 and maybe more. So, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg here, because go ahead, next slide. Because our goal is, as Richard mentioned at the beginning, is to provide zero emission deliveries for all of our customers by 2025. We're starting with New York City, but that is by no means the end of it. We're going around the United States and around the world, actually, to figure out how to provide zero emission delivery for all of our customers. So with that, I will hand it over to James to tell you a little bit more about the program details.
Thanks, Steve. So hey, I'm Jimmy Eberhard. I'm the founder and CEO of Fluid Truck. And so just to give you a background on Fluid, we're a truck sharing platform. Effectively, you can go on an app, book a vehicle, check it out, and be on the road in a matter of a couple minutes. Really focusing on how do we take away the biggest friction points of getting people into the right truck for the right job, and allowing them to to easily and flexibly jump in and out of a vehicle to get into the right vehicle to do the job. And so off of our solution, we effectively allow a wide range of vehicles. We've been pushing in and started deploying vehicles with Ikea here back in December of last year. And it's really a part of our goals and what we see as a great opportunity to not only reduce the stop, reduce the emissions, also provide a high quality, safe vehicle that's able to go out there and deliver out packages for last mile, mid-mile delivery. So our app, effectively takes away, what would traditionally be a rental experience of waiting in a line or having to go to a depot at 9 o'clock in the morning and return back at 5 o'clock that day. We offer 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, access to vehicles. So no longer do people need to own the vehicles. They can quickly swap in and out. And we're really enabling this mechanism as the truck as a service, and allowing people and contractors to be able to get into the right vehicle and be able to make that transition and not have to put out the capital cost or make a commitment to a brand new class of vehicle where a lot of people are unfamiliar with, and really stepping behind the wheel of a zero emission electric truck for the first time. So we really focus on the platform side and work with retailers, 3PLs, independent contractors to provide them with the access to the vehicle, and the easy access, the place and location, and getting them the right vehicle for the right job. So as we kind of look here, starting with Ikea as one of the first partners out there, we're looking at how do we get more businesses involved. I mean, to get to a place where we have substantial EVs in place, we look at infrastructure there that becomes a access point and a shared asset that multiple companies can be taking advantage of. But really, it's starting to look at how do we get companies like, what Ikea has made that commitment to go out there and start pushing and being really the trailblazer at getting EVs out there and really transforming the whole class of vehicles that bring packages to the front door every day. And we look at how do we take these vehicles and allow them to be accessible by multiple companies. So effectively having fewer trucks be able to be servicing more businesses, driving the cost down and driving the access up. So as we look at, how are we exploring, developing lots, we really are looking for, businesses to go out there and make commitments that they're going to start moving over to electric vehicles. And so that way we can go out there and make the investment and bring the access and make it easy for, any company, any delivery service that is looking to drive sustainability into what they do. We can provide the assets, the access, and the platform. So it reduces the cost and the exposure on it, but really is, taking that step in and making that commitment going forward.
Thanks, Jimmy. Rich, do you want to chime in here?
Sorry, I was the Zoom sin of being muted. So just to add on that, so what we're talking about here today, and looking forward to the Q&A, and there's a chat feature as well if people want to chime in there, is really thinking about how do we decarbonize and electrify the last mile deliveries throughout the region and do it in a way that doesn't require owning a vehicle. And that's, this is such an innovative model. And it's, of course, not the only thing that's going on. And we wanted to take a minute and just let folks know that there's an entire parallel track going on that is embedded in the policy world, thinking about state policies, city policies, other level of government policies, as well as incentives and other tools that will help ensure that projects like this succeed and other projects succeed as we move towards zero emission last mile deliveries. And so through that lens, we're focusing on things like how do we create space for charging infrastructure, whether that's charging infrastructure at a truck depot or charging infrastructure in other locations, everything from the warehouses to on the street and everything in between. How do we investigate and expand on the incentives and creative financing? We've heard about one model here, but how do we make sure that that companies that want to ship in a zero emission way can do so and that the numbers pencil out? We're looking at ways to ensure that as the entire supply chain moves towards zero emission, do we have the zoning in place? Do we have other land use pieces that need to be taken into account? Do we make sure, do we have all the different policy tools lined up to increase EV adoption? All of that is happening in a parallel track. Maybe that's the topic for another webinar. But it's important for everybody in the audience who's thinking about, well, how would this work for my company? How would I get my packages delivered in a zero emission way? What do I need to do? Wanted you to know that there's a parallel track going on to make sure that the policies and the incentives that are being offered in the city and the region and the states are pointed in the right direction to help you achieve those goals. And we're doing that, from the perspective of how do we ensure last mile zero emission delivery. But we're also making sure that we're doing it as part of an overall approach towards emerging electric vehicle policy, that this is a very important piece that needs to be accounted for and embedded in all the different solution sets. And part of that is an environmental issue. Part of it is actually an economic recovery issue. It's really important to all of us that we're creating accessible and long-term green jobs. In the 5 years before the COVID pandemic began, clean energy, clean transportation jobs in our region grew at roughly 2.5 times the state average. So it was one of the fastest growing sectors in our region pre-pandemic, and it's going to be important as we grow our way out of the pandemic that we reestablish that growth pattern. So we see this as part of that as well. And of course, we see it, as Harold mentioned at the outset, that this is all part of how do we protect the communities that are most impacted by climate change. That we know that the pollution levels in communities that are traditionally overburdened with diesel pollution are also overburdened with increased asthma attacks, bronchitis, cancer, premature deaths that are attributable to air pollution and so on. And so just as those communities bore the brunt of dirty diesel pollution in decades past, they will also capture the disproportionate benefits of zero-emission vehicles that will now take the place of those dirty diesels. So we just wanted to touch on that for a minute or two. So you saw what's happening parallel to what we're doing in this pilot project. And then I'll pass it back to, I believe, Harold next, who will walk it through a bit of next steps and start the Q&A.
Sure. And before we transition in, and maybe I should encourage folks now to field any questions you have in the chat box. We do have the manual option to unmute attendees. So if it's easier, if it's more conversational question or discussion, raise your hand or acknowledge it in the chat option, and we'll see on our end if we can unmute you and have you engaged here. We also understand that there's various kind of stakeholders present on the call today, from different logistic partners to development corporations to even some EJ allies and partners. So we understand that there could be a myriad of questions, and hopefully we can answer all of those. But to that point, I think we all agree that the transition to the clean energy economy must be just and fair. And unfortunately, clean air policies, whether that's things like subsidies for rooftop solar or, different energy efficiency weatherization programs, they have tended to benefit, disproportionately benefit high earners, right? So how do we ensure that we transition to a clean energy economy from one that's based on fossil fuels, where some jobs will inevitably, disappear and others will be created? How do we prepare our workforce for that shift? So that's an important conversation that we'd love to have as well. Thinking about the different community EJ perceptions around this work and making sure, again, that it's an equitable and just transition. EDF has developed actually a proximity mapping tool where we identified different fulfillment centers and warehouses in different regions across the U.S., calculated the population within a half-mile radius of those facilities, and have been able to identify, unfortunately, some stark images around health burden, just living within a half-mile radius of a warehouse cluster, where you have spikes in instances of COPD, asthma prevalence, lung cancer, hypertension, you name it. So our idea, again, is to use quantitative metrics to identify the locations that will benefit most from this EV transition. Then work on co-facilitating or co-locating different social services, workforce development programs, EV charging infrastructure in those same communities. So with that being said, as some next steps, we'd like to have, follow-up. It could be one-on-one individual conversation with some of the brands and corporations on the call. But overall, this EV sponsorship model, which has been touted and produced here and presented here by Fluid Truck in partnership with Ikea, we'd love for this to take place, in New York and New Jersey, alongside other brands that ideally ship large and big and bulky items. With that being said, moving forward as far as goals for this meeting, we identified partners. We'd like to, again, develop some warm leads around different shippers that will commit to EV shipping services. We'd love to talk specifically around different options for financing, locating the charging infrastructure and additional EVs. But ideally, again, pilot in a location and profile with the community support that will identify local benefits, right? So working alongside some of the EJ colleagues on the call today to, again, prioritize which boroughs and which neighborhoods will benefit from these deployments. With that, maybe we'll open the floor for questions. And I see one has just came in. And again, if you don't want to field the question in the chat and feel like it's more conversational in nature, I have the option to unmute on my end. So raise your hand or denote that in the chat here. But the first question is, what role do you all see in the secondhand market for electric medium heavy duty vehicles to expand access to clean transportation? And what challenges can you identify? So again, I'll say, what role do we see in a secondhand market for electric medium heavy duty vehicles to expand access to clean transportation? And what challenges can you identify? Does anyone kind of want to volunteer?
Yeah, let me hop in and take that one. I mean, right now we're looking at the first generation of EV medium duty, heavy duty trucks. And so, there hasn't been enough cycles of production to start seeing secondary markets or the vehicles change hands. I think it's going to be, a number of years out before we start seeing it. Most of the major OEMs are just starting to release out their vehicles. I mean, Ford's starting to release out their medium duty vehicles here later this year. And then you see, GM and FCA following suit in 2022 and 2023 in terms of their vehicle classes coming out here. On the heavier duty side, I mean, a heavier and medium duty side, I mean, there are a number of different companies that are producing vehicles. A lot of them are smaller and aren't producing mass quantities yet. But we will see that change here radically over the next 12 to 24 months.
I mean, I think that this is one of the reasons why, the rental model for us made a lot of sense, is because a lot of the independent contractors or contract carriers, they purchase their vehicles on the secondary market today. So they're not purchasing, brand new internal combustion engine vehicles necessarily anyway. So, I think that's another one of these things that comes up in a lot of these conversations, is this kind of TCO calculation between new ICE vehicles and new electric vehicles. And the reality is, in the home delivery space, that's not the calculation at all that's taking place, right? It's used ICE vehicles versus whatever is available in the electric market. And so this kind of addresses that and says, well, okay, look, like Jimmy said, there's not going to be a secondary market for electric commercial vehicles for a couple of years yet. And until that happens, how do those guys get into getting access to electric vehicles today? Because the vehicles themselves are available today. So this allows for that access that I think is so important. But to the person's question, I mean, the secondary market is extremely important overall for overall EV adoption, because while the rental model is out there, if you really want to look at the number of commercial vehicles that are tooling around out there, I mean, most commercial vehicles are running in the secondary are in the secondary market, right? They have not been purchased new. In fact, the top 500 fleets in the United States only make up 10% or less than 10% of the total commercial vehicles that are on the road today. So a lot of the other vehicles are still tooling around for years and years after their first life. And so it does become extremely important to get to that secondary market. One thing that policymakers and folks like that can do is help support those residual values on those vehicles, which does help people finance new vehicles and get into them a little easier. So support for residual values is important from a policy standpoint, and secondary market for electric vehicles is also important for EV adoption. So, but you got to start somewhere. So this is where it starts.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those thorough answers. And then here's another question from the group. Rich, it looks like this one is directed to you, but others can chime in. You mentioned the importance of zoning and making the space to facilitate this transition. Is there any work from the folks on this panel to share this narrative either publicly or to elected officials?
Sure. So I think that the challenge that we see here is that the traditional notion of commercial areas being commercial and residential areas being residential has really changed dramatically in the last decade or two in our region, right? And maybe it's true that the only thing constant is change, but in New York City and in the dense populated areas of New Jersey, that's certainly true. And so what traditionally had been industrial areas, warehouse areas, where distribution centers would be, are now surrounded by increasing numbers of residential renters, owners, and so on. And the interplay of that has raised questions about what's appropriate in any place, and zoning and land use questions and debates that follow from that. What's interesting to me here is that traditionally, some of the neighborhoods that have high numbers of diesel trucks and therefore diesel pollution will now be the areas where we will see an increasing number of zero emission trucks that will help solve that problem. That's a really good thing. I don't know that the policy world has fully captured that yet. You know, if you can look at the New York City debate around commercial waste as an example, where there was a multi-year debate about moving into a franchise system as a way to reduce the number of trucks, reduce the amount of pollution. Not part of that discussion was, well, suppose those trucks are zero emission, suppose they're electric, and how do we incentivize that happening as part of it? I think that there's going to be, as we move into the new administration here in the city, and as these issues become more and more important at the state level in both New York and New Jersey, I think there'll be more attention to that. And I think that what Fluid and Ikea and EDF are doing here is really setting the stage for, well, how can you do less mile deliveries in a way that doesn't add to the pollution burden of communities that live near or adjacent to warehouses, distribution centers, major truck thoroughfares, and so on. And so very much that's a policy conversation going on. Very much elected officials are a part of it, as well as senior officials in government. And obviously we're all anticipating and eagerly awaiting the Adams administration here in the city to have that conversation with them and see where that goes.
Can I just chime in here? I think that like the zoning is super important, because right now, you know, if you're a mom and pop trucking company, I mean, you have to ask yourself, where do these trucks park today? And the answer is, you know, nobody really knows, because they park all over the place, and because they're kind of, you know, they park in kind of an ad hoc manner. And so, but when it comes to electrification, you know, those vehicles tend to be, you know, they have to be tethered to a charging source. And so it becomes even more important for us to allocate space for commercial vehicle parking and charging, with charging. These are the same kind of issues that you face in, you know, multi-tenant dwellings and things like this. So how do you enable those folks to access the electric vehicles? And I do think we have to designate some space here for certainly for personal electric vehicles, but also for commercial electric vehicles. Otherwise, what you see is are companies like Ikea, you know, lighting up their own parking lots, which is not necessarily beneficial to, I mean, it's beneficial to the folks that live close to those industrial areas, but it's not necessarily beneficial to the neighborhoods and where those drivers live, right? So that has to be considered as well. Like those folks need parking as well. So yeah, I would say it was extremely important.
Thank you for that. Want to be conscious of time here. We do have about 20 more minutes, and a couple more questions have come in. So I'll start there, but also want to remind attendees that they can be unmuted, you know, if there's any dialogue specific to support some of the questions that have been asked. The next question here is a short one, but, you know, would you like to talk to original equipment manufacturers? I think the short answer there is yes. Where we've seen within the equity and EJ community, at least, conversations around some of the critical materials and the parts that are inevitably as a part of the production process of electric vehicles, right? So where is it coming from? You know, is it coming from the developing world? Is it here in the U.S.? But we should obviously look from a holistic lens at the life cycle impacts of these vehicles, whether that's upstream, downstream, or end of life. So again, I think it's key as a part of that life cycle conversation. And if we want to be sustainable and just in this transition, to have initial conversation with some of the original equipment manufacturers. But That's my short answer. I don't know if anyone else wanted to weigh in. If not, we'll move along because a couple of the questions have come in.
And we do work with the OEMs on helping them guide what's out there, what we're seeing as being one of the kind of early fleet management companies that's got a substantial EV, medium duty and vehicle base. And we are helping them kind of guide what the roadmap is, what is needed, where we're seeing problems. We're playing a part in those early discussions with at least the big three OEMs here in the U.S.
Thank you. All right. Another question here from Christine. Last mile delivery company could own their own vehicles, rent their own vehicles, or do a combination. For how many is the rental the right business model? So the model you are showing here regarding gaining access to electric trucks.
It's a great question. And I think as we kind of look at small, mid-sized businesses, the complexities of buying, selling vehicles, managing, maintaining, filing insurance claims, all the things that go along with managing a fleet of vehicles, usually the main reason why they go out and buy fleets of vehicles is so they don't have to worry about renting, because traditionally renting commercial vehicles is done Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then there's some providers that have some weekend access, but it's a pretty taxing process to out and rent vehicles, and it forces a lot of people into buying either older fleets or buying fleets altogether when it really isn't their core competency. And so as we kind of look at it, we take away the whole notion of having to have a fleet manager on staff to do all those things. And I really look at what we're inspiring and pushing is really moving to this theme of truck as a service, where you can have a flexible fleet that scales up and down. When it's your peak time of year, you can peak up to that. When it's slower, you can do it. And you can do it in an instant and make it simple. And I think as we kind of look, 20 years ago, you used to own your own servers. And today you never think twice about buying servers for your company. You go out there and you go to AWS or Google Cloud for anything you need, and you no longer need a network admin. And we kind of see vehicles going that same way, where we can make it super efficient, safe, and accessible. And you no longer need to control the asset, and you never have the wrong vehicle for the wrong job. And we really just drive that flexibility around. So there definitely is a needs for people to own their own fleets. I really think that we allow that flexible basis for businesses and independent contractors to come step in, be effective.
I would also say that the legal environment in the United States is rife with co-employment laws and regulations and things like this, which fortunately or unfortunately, it's a debate for a different time, pushes delivery companies generally don't own their own vehicles. And renting, as it becomes easier and easier, like, thanks to companies like Fluid, is I think going to play a more prominent role. But certainly even large delivery companies don't tend to own their own final mile fleets. They like to keep the cost variable and use contractors to do that, more of a kind of a crowdsourced model. So rightly or wrongly, most, unless you're Amazon or one of the big fleet companies, you tend not to own your own vehicles.
Thank you both. Two more questions came in. First, maybe just piggyback off this initial conversation. Does Fluid help drivers plan charging for their trip in advance? So, will they have the needed range for the specific trips, and is charging included in that rental price?
Yeah. And so on the answer is, yeah, the charging's included into the rental price. And then really what we're looking to do is you can see the charge of the vehicle in the application and see the range of how far you can go. And so you give that ability to see the vehicle, the range it has, and the capabilities to do it. We don't currently have anything in the app right now that allows you to tether a trip and plan your route, but we are working on tools to make it easier and more effective for drivers to step in and be effective at driving a route and planning it through.
Perfect. and maybe that's, a part of those one-on-one conversations, right, that we're encouraging where, as the EV manager, the routes and the boroughs and the zip codes and the neighborhoods that you generally service for a specific job. So that can, I'm sure, be built into the telematics for the actual vehicles and identifying which vehicles make the most sense for that job itself. So again, just want to encourage these follow-up conversations, and we'll actually be sending out an exit survey based on this webinar where you'll lean on us and we'll make those connections. We have a question that came in here, more specific to the earlier conversation around the secondhand market. Once more electric, medium, heavy duty vehicles hit the road and we get more vehicles available for the second market, what is the initial thought of using vehicles which batteries have been refurbished? What would you need to prove to use that specific vehicle? Any thoughts on, I guess, battery degradation and the impact that has on range, price of the vehicles, and so forth?
I mean, when it comes to battery degradation, I mean, we still are seeing the very early days in terms of how long batteries will work. I mean, the quotes and what we have been given by OEMs and what the expected life for batteries and range and the degradation over time, is pretty long in terms of the how long they last. I think if you look at like Tesla is probably the best case studies out there in terms of the lifetime of the batteries, and looking at vehicles that are being built for 500,000 or 1,000,000 miles, when traditionally they're being built on the ICE side, the equivalent class of vehicle is being built for 100 to 200,000 miles. So, I mean, you definitely have the potential of longevity, but, right now it is early days, and it's from a theoretical perspective, it's absolutely there, but we haven't gone long enough in the cycle to actually see it firsthand. So it should be there. But time will tell, and we'll see that over the course of time.
All right, thanks for that. And one more additional question just came in. Are there any considerations of induction charging as part of the solution in New York City? Rich, I'm not sure if that's one that's better directed to you or if others have heard. But again, is induction charging a part of the solution in New York City?
Yeah, sure. Tom, thanks for that question. Induction charging, obviously in this pilot, we're not looking at induction charging. I know that there are some companies that are thinking about induction charging and what would be the right first demonstration of induction charging in New York City. I know that, there have been some companies out of Europe and out of Israel that have been piloting some induction charging there, I think in Sweden, as well as Israel. And the application that probably is most relevant here would be more like, a test of transit buses going down Fifth Avenue that are topping off as they drive. That sort of thing, rather than the kind of last mile projects that we're talking about here, where every day the truck is taking a different route. Gosh, I'm trying to think of the name of the company that was looking into New York City a while ago. If I can think of it, I'm happy to have a follow-up.
Was it Hevo or one of those? Was it Hevo or one of those? I love induction charging. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I do too.
The installation tends to be a little costly relative to, compared to, putting up a pole type charger.
That's right.
But I mean, I like the idea of it because you don't have to, you don't have to deal with the, every driver being able to, plug the truck in correctly at the end of the day, which seems like a small problem, but when you have a larger fleet, it can crop up. So, so yeah, I think that there's definitely room for inductive charging at some point, but it just has to be planned a little bit further ahead of time, like when you're building the parking lot or something to put in inductive charging. I think makes a lot of sense.
Great. And one additional question that just came in, how do you believe the widespread use of this Assuming again that's EV, medium heavy duty trucks will affect the location of last mile logistics centers, especially in dense urban areas. So again, how do you believe the widespread use of zero emission vehicles will affect the location of the last mile logistics centers in dense centers?
Last mile logistics centers are already, I mean, the distribution warehouses of our partners and other transportation companies are generally located pretty as close as possible to these population centers. I mean, that's where it makes the most sense. I would say that, like, from a form versus function activity, they may have a bigger impact. Electrification might have a bigger impact. For example, I think in a lot of cases where you see distribution centers located in urban areas, the cost for the land can be relatively expensive, and so they tend to be kind of cross dock facilities where trucks can come, bump a dock, redistribute goods to smaller trucks, and then those trucks can leave. And so they don't have a lot of parking, for one thing. So they certainly don't have any charging today. But I think as electrification happens, they're going to have to dedicate more of that space towards parking and charging those trucks, where it becomes more like a depot rather than a place for trucks to just bump a dock and then head off on their way. But I think that but if we're planning like a more sustainable logistics center, like some communities are talking about these types of plans, then the location is super important. You want to be as close as possible to that population center.
And I look at it as that, I mean, we're witnessing kind of a transformation in how shopping and consumer behavior sits today, where, I mean, brick and mortar is quickly going to e-commerce, and that you're seeing smaller micro distribution centers, dark stores popping up and taking the place of traditional brick and mortars. And I think, as we start seeing more and more delivery, whether it's coming out of a store, whether it's coming out of a depot, a micro center, those parking lots that we see a lot of the traditional retail infrastructure built on, a lot of those parking lots, starting to move over to, EV parking and charging. But I mean, COVID definitely accelerated the adoption of internet and e-commerce shopping and the need for last mile delivery to facilitate goods and services showing up to the home. And definitely within that, we're watching a lot of transformation in the space. I think the repurposing of traditional retail to be dark stores or hybrid, delivery centers and shopping stores together as one, and repurposing parking for that as well. So we also kind of look at, having, the rental fleet that's there, that you can have one vehicle that's used by a driver Monday through Friday, and the weekends used by another driver. And instead of, you driving that vehicle where it's sitting at your house, you drive to the depot. Instead of you're riding a bike, you're taking public transportation, you're hopping in an Uber, driving a smaller car to the distribution center, grabbing the truck, loading it up, and going on your route. And that's how we kind of see the natural evolution of where it goes is, have the right vehicle. Don't drive a 26-foot box truck as a commuter car to get to the depot. Drive that loaded up out to run the route.
I think you're really hitting a very important point here, which is rethinking what's the role of the vehicle and thinking about transportation of the goods on the truck, transportation as a service, rather than the truck being just a single truck owned by one entity that's only doing one thing. And I think that, you're right, COVID accelerated trends that were already happening. And that's broader than just last mile delivery, but it's really how the streetscape operates as a whole. And I think that means thinking about parking. It means thinking about charging. It thinks creating space for pedestrians and bicyclists, creating a safer transportation infrastructure and network, and all those different things combined, and how it interacts with this conversation that's really interesting is thinking about, well, why do you have to own the truck if you're only using it a certain number of hours a day, if you're not actually in the business of owning and operating trucks? Maybe there's a better way for your package to get from one place to the final destination, and the fluid model enables that to happen in a more seamless way, and enables that truck to now be of service. So you have, at other times, so your vehicle utilization is up, which in the long run means you have a smaller number of vehicles actually on the road. And you have less of a need for parking. You have all sorts of different indirect benefits that come from that, but it all comes from thinking about how do we rethink what's the role of the vehicle? Why do we have to own it? Do we have to own it?
Yeah.
And what can we envision for that vehicle when I'm not using it? How can that vehicle be used? Which now changes the whole TCO calculation. I mean, if you think about it, I'll just take one more sec on this. If you think about it, part of the reason why there are so many old trucks out there delivering boxes in the city or handling the drayage routes is because the TCO calculation is premised on everybody who carries a box owns the truck. But if we have a different model, well, now the TCO is different, and it enables a cleaner, more efficient, safer vehicle because we're thinking about the truck as a service rather than as an owned asset. It's not right for everybody, but for many, it will be a great opportunity, a great solution. So,
and Rick, to that point, I mean, someone asked the question of, can you rent long term? And you absolutely can. I mean, we have people that rent for months or years at a time. But really, we like when we have one customer that's doing a last mile delivery route during the day, and then we have someone that's doing a mid-mile route that's doing it during the night. And having two people use that truck so we can drive the cost of that vehicle down to both parties and help make it more efficient and take a vehicle off the road. And we love those optimizations on it. But it is a new way of thinking, and it's a way that we try to see that economics will eventually make that more effective and make it a better way and help drive the behavior change and reduce the vehicle count.
All right. Well, thanks guys. We're actually coming up on the hour. It's 12:59 now. If there's any closing thoughts, closing comments, but we've kept track of who's engaged through the Q&A, and again can follow up individually. But please be on lookout for an exit survey that will speak to some specific questions around your last mile needs. And again, we acknowledge that there are other stakeholder groups on the call, different development corporations, logistic partners, and EJ allies who we'd love to have a more robust one-on-one conversation on ways to deploy this pilot in specific boroughs in New York. But any closing thoughts, Steve, James, or Rich?
Just that, we're here as collaborators, not competitors. So please give me a shout if you have any other questions. You want to talk a little bit more about this subject. Happy to talk. Love to hear myself talk. But yeah, please give me a ring. We'll talk more about it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Same with us. We this is something we're very passionate about, and we want to see less trucks on the road, higher quality, safer vehicles out there, getting the job done. So love to have conversations on how we can collaborate. And it takes a community to get the number of vehicles to the right spot to really enable it. So I mean, we really are looking for partners out there to help us push EV trucks and start driving down emissions on the road.
And I guess my last closing thought is that I hope that this is the start of a conversation rather than a one-off lunchtime chat. We've all gone through this year and a half of webinars and Zooms and everything else, and I'm always struck by how if we were in a more normal in-person environment after this is over, well, we'd go out of the conference room or convention room and we'd have a cup of coffee and we'd keep talking. And so I encourage us, everybody, if you've heard something that's interesting, if you want to explore ideas, please reach out to any of us. As Harold said, there is an exit survey which will help facilitate that. But as formal or informal as you want to be, whether virtual, in person, let's have that cup of coffee and keep the conversation going. It's a super topic. It's evolving as we speak. and we'd love for you to be a part of it.
All right. Thanks so much. And again, EDF, thanks you for joining, and we'll be following up shortly. Contact information here on the screen, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. All right. Have a good evening.
Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.